This is World Federation Neurology YouTube channel again. As part of our video interviews, I had the pleasure and privilege of introducing you to one of the very unique person. There's something common between this particular gentleman and me, as I myself train in the same country as this particular gentleman was born. This is Professor Emeritus Austin Sumner. Many senior colleagues would know him very well. He was a very well-known name in neurology during his day and even today, but some of the younger generation might not know him. He was born in a very small West Coast town, but majestic, beautiful, heaven-like town in New Zealand called Hokitika. But then he climbed up in the ladder to move to the other part of the world. Let's hear from him on this journey and some of the interesting bits that we might enjoy today. And I'm sure there will be a lot of take-home messages for youngsters. Professor Austin Sumner, thank you so much for giving us time to chat to us on behalf of World Federation Neurology. It is a great delight and honor to host you today.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to participate. I doubt if I have anything valuable to say, but certainly I very much value my long-term associations with the World Federation of Neurology. And I especially can congratulate your president, Dr. Bill Carroll, whom I've known for many years.
Yes, he had been around. Austin, tell us about your childhood and what made you to be interested in medicine. How did this happen?
Well, although I've founded something of a dynasty in our own family in medicine, I don't come from a line of physicians. My father was a technician with the post office in New Zealand. He was very proud of his technological skills back then, being a first-class Morse operator. And my introduction to electrophysiology was really building crystal sets all those years ago. And actually, I quite mastered the Morse code. But that's very obsolete technology in this day and age.
At Hokitika, did you have an exceptionally good biology teacher to spark your interest in biology and the pursuing a career in medicine later on?
Well, look, I was born in Hokitika,
right.
but lived there for a very short time.
Mm-hmm.
I think we moved to Greymouth when I was about 1 year old. Mm-hmm. So other than being born in the town that's the center of the greenstone or Punamu industry in New Zealand, I have no more claims other than my ancestors being there for mm-hmm. the gold mm-hmm. for gold mining.
Mm-hmm.
But really, my education was in Greymouth initially. Mm-hmm. But then I moved to Wellington College because in Wellington, because my parents thought educational opportunities were better there.
Mm-hmm.
And they were right, although and I really began my education at Wellington College. Went to Victoria University for my medical intermediate, and of course went through the University of Otago Medical School for my early medical education.
That was at Dunedin campus, Austin?
Well, there was only the Dunedin campus when we started out, and then they evolved this system of having satellite campuses in Christchurch and in Wellington. And of course, Auckland went its own way.
Dusty Allen, was he around at that time, or was he no longer around by that time?
Well, you know a lot. Dusty Allen was not around when I was at Wellington, but he was a greatly revered figure in in New Zealand neurology, but the two people in neurology that greatly influenced me early on was, of course, Jack Bergen and Richard Hornibrook. But of course, before I encountered clinical neurology, I did do a master's degree in medical science in neurophysiology, and I did that with Professor Archie McIntyre.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the light bulb going on in my own career, because I was very much turned on by electrophysiology. And that's been the theme through my career.
That was the golden era of neurophysiology, or basically neurophysiology coming of age. Would that be correct to say?
I think so. I mean, I claimed that I inherited a rig that Professor J.C. Eccles, the Nobel laureate, of course, used when he was at the professor of neurology, the professor of physiology at Otago.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the great fortune of really, as a young person, having an absolutely first-class electrophysiology rig. I was introduced to microelectroding. Of course, the first intracellular microelectroding was performed at the University of Otago. And I also had the great pleasure of and influence of working with Professor Ian McDonald,
mm-hmm.
who was completing his PhD at the same time as I was doing my master's degree at Otago. And Ian had an enormous influence on me way back then. You'll know that he is such a prominent, or was such a prominent figure in neurology, and especially in the field of multiple sclerosis.
Absolutely. The Austin, it always the intriguing to me. I did most of my neurology training in Christchurch under the patronage of Phil Parkin and others. I greatly admire their teaching and what they impart upon me. Being such a small country, how does New Zealand continue to produce these terrific leaders? What's the secret?
Well, I don't know. I think that we, as a small country, New Zealand continues to punch well above its weight in the world. And from this distance, I'm still so proud to be a New Zealander, even though I have not lived in New Zealand for many, many decades. I don't know what it was. There was, within the academic system, there was a very tight collegiality. And so that within the groups that were specializing, I think the quality of learning was of a very high order. I mentioned the lineage from Archie McIntyre through Jack Eccles and was really, we had the feeling when we worked with these people that we were working with the best in the world, and the fact that we were geographically isolated down there in New Zealand in no way made us feel that we were isolated in the intellectual sense.
Absolutely. I remember as a young general medical registrar having arrived in New Zealand from fairly rural Sri Lanka. I met one of the young ID physicians in Palmerston North Hospital, and I wasn't particularly interested in get back to general medical training at that time. I thought that I would go and do some sort of a biomedical PhD at Massey University or something, and then I'll head back to Sri Lanka. So that was my plan. But then I got fed up with not being able to do anything. So I just woke up to the hospital and asked from somebody in ER. My wife was working there at that time because she was a graduate from Australia. So I asked from one of the ED folks, tell me who is the youngest physician in this hospital. I thought that a younger person would approach someone of my color with sort of more ease at that time. So that was a great Dr. Richard Beavers, and he was such a kind gentleman. I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt as it was summer at that time. He said, well, you look like a fine young man with a good CV, Tissa. Why don't you wear a tie and dress properly and come tomorrow morning to join me for a ward round? So I did the first ward round, and I was amazed. I was for the first time seeing a physician doing a beautiful ward round, exactly translating what you read from a textbook of medicine, Harrison's or other. This is not a criticism for some of my teachers back in Sri Lanka. They were busy with a lot more patients. But here you could see that physicians practicing exactly point by point what you read from books. So it was very difficult for anybody to stop me from getting back to medicine and my first love, neurology. Let's I agree. New Zealand, just like Australia, punch way above these countries' waist in almost everything in medicine and neurology. Being such a sort of short history and young countries and far away from other places. Austin, you had an illustrious career, and you choose neurology, clinical neurology. You already told us how you were inspired by some great dons like late Professor Eccles, who of course went on to win Nobel Prize. And there's a center under his name in Australian National University, which we were about to lose as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic. And I tweeted madly saying that you can't let these things go down, and there's such a rich history. Fortunately, they saved it. I'm thankful for that. Tell us about your journey to UK. Was it easy travel, or was it was it via ship? So share your experience of your first visit to UK.
Well, I was very fortunate in that I was awarded a Nuffield traveling fellowship, which I took in, and that was a very generous fellowship in that it allowed us to fly to the UK. All of my contemporaries at that time did travel by ship. And I think in retrospect that they enjoyed that, although many of them were in steerage, but I traveled in relative luxury and flew to the UK. Now, this was a very interesting branch point because at the same time as I decided to go to the UK, I had been awarded a Van Cleef Fellowship at Monash University in Australia. Mm-hmm. And so I was a little torn as to whether I was going to do further postgraduate work in Australia or go the traditional way and go to the UK. Mm-hmm. But being a conservative fellow, I went to the UK, mm-hmm. never realizing how Australia was going to fulfill its destiny in the way it is at the moment. It's really very impressive, the economic growth and influence of Australia. And I have hold my Australian colleagues in very high regard.
Which year was this, Austin? And were you married with children at that time? Was Charlotte born at that time or not yet?
Oh, you know about Charlotte, do you?
I've heard of her, and I think she's...
No, Charlotte, of course, is a professor at Johns Hopkins in neurology and the neurogeneticist. But no, I was married to a very lovely lady. My wife is Dr. Jane Sumner, but Charlotte was born in the Middlesex Hospital in London after we arrived in London. And interestingly enough, our son was born later in San Francisco. But it was curious that we arrived in the United States, and I'm skipping ahead and we'll go back, but I was confronted with the American medical system at that time because we arrived with a pre-existing condition and couldn't get health insurance right. in San Francisco. The pre-existing condition, of course, was my wife's pregnancy.
Right.
And I must say, I have never been comfortable with the way my fellow American colleagues have organized their medical system. But it looks a hopeless case to reform it.
Right.
Anyway, let's go back to
UK.
To the UK.
This was this was Queen Square first, isn't it?
Yes, it was the National Hospital, and in those days it was called the National Hospital for nervous diseases.
Mm-hmm. Who were at the helm at that time in Queen Square? Well,
the person that had the most influence on me at Queen Square was, of course, Professor Roger Gilead,
mm-hmm.
who was the only professor of neurology at Queen Square at that time.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there were only a handful of professors of neurology in the UK at that time, although that changed a great deal. Roger was a bit of a martinet, and he drove his fellows quite hard.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a person that I became very friendly with, and in fact formed a very close relationship after I left Queen Square. So I owe him a lot.
So P.K. Thomas, Anita Harding, David Marsden, they were around the London at that time?
Yes, of course they were. P.K. was a dear friend and a lovely man. He was senior to me.
Mm-hmm.
But David Marsden, Michael Harrison were contemporaries of mine, and we all got on the house together at Queen Square.
Mm-hmm. Late Jim Lance from Australia, had he been and gone from Queen Square at that time, or did he arrive later or earlier?
There's an interesting connection between the individuals we've mentioned, because Jim Lance, a wonderful man and a headache expert, his son married Roger Gilead's daughter.
Right.
So there's something of the incestuous nature among neurologists there.
Yes. So sorry, I disturbed you. So you keep going. So you made the good friends with all these big dons, and was it quite?
I want to mention that there was Jim Lance, of course, and he was at the University of New South Wales. But I was also very much influenced and thought was a wonderful man is Professor Jim McLeod and his later protege, Professor John Pollard, were also close colleagues who, in the case of John Pollard, he came and spent a little time with me at the University of Pennsylvania later on. We remained close friends.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. Jim was a great person. I never had the luxury of the learning from him as such, but I met up with him on multiple times at the local scientific meetings, and I'm now hosting an annual symposium under his name for the last 4 or 5 years in my local hospital in Melbourne, with a named oration also. He was a great figure. He is a great. He sort of created a legacy in Australia for sure.
Absolutely.
And was it quite daunting as a young trainee coming from New Zealand and settling down in Queen Square at that time? Was it a fear-based, hierarchical system-based system, or was it quite collegial and friendly at the same time with ample learning opportunities?
It was a fear-based system.
Right.
At least Roger Gilead's ward rounds were. However, not everybody responded the same way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Englishmen that were going through the system were quite cowed. Mm-hmm. But as an Antipodean, I think one brought a slightly different attitude, and I got myself into trouble quite frequently by putting my hand up and asking questions when I was
Right.
in the wrong row to be asking questions.
Right. Right.
As you know, we were strictly hierarchically arranged in ward rounds, with the senior staff being in the front row, the senior registrars being in the second row, and also RANs being in the back row.
Right.
And the back row were not supposed to ask questions.
But I could picture that Kiwis and Aussies would break these rules regularly because they are not used to controlled by rules or systems as such, even today. So any memorable experiences that you would like to share with our viewers from that time?
Well, so many. I should have given this more thought, but I mean, obviously, it's a time when you're sopping up knowledge in great gulps.
Mm.
Clearly, I was very privileged to be there as a contemporary of David Marsden, who was a very clever fellow and somebody that I admired greatly. And I mentioned Michael Harrison, who was went on to be the consultant at the Middlesex Hospital, who was a very kindly man from whom I learned a great deal. You know, at that stage of our training, we learn more from our contemporaries than we do from our teachers, I think. And so there was great collegiality between us as residents or house physicians, even though the staff, by and large, kept up their rather formal approach. Roger was probably more formal than many others, but he was the one that had the greatest influence on me.
Was Jane under enormous amount of pressure by this time while you are soaking up knowledge and the trying to raise a family, or did you have friends and others to support the dealing with first pregnancy and then raising Charlotte, of course?
Look, I was quite senior when I was acting as a houseman at Queen Square, and we were on call a great deal. Mm-hmm. So our wives we didn't see a whole lot of them.
Right.
I mean, I was on call every second night, and so by contemporary standards, it was quite stressful. Mm-hmm. But I still remember, one's in that very robust phase of one's life, and it didn't bother us. And, when other people are suffering to the same extent, you don't complain, you just get on with it.
Mm-hmm. I think that is also something. That is also something that I have witnessed in Australia and New Zealand. The successful people seems to not complain and get on with the tasks as best as they can, irrespective of the challenges that they face. I'm sure when you were spending time in Queen Square at that time, you were probably not planning to go to Pennsylvania, and your plan probably would have been to come back to Australia and settle down. How did this occur? Who were your contemporaries in New Zealand at that time who are still around today?
Oh, I have to think about that a bit. I don't think too many. Mm-hmm. But no, I had no intention of going to the United States, except perhaps to get my BTA. There were some people, the American influence in neurology was starting to creep into those of us doing a traditional British training. Mm-hmm. I've got to think of some of the people that were involved. Dr. Mastaglia, mm-hmm. who's from Perth.
Frank
Mastaglia, yes. He came the reverse way. He went to the United States first, and then came back via
Queen Square.
Mm-hmm. And I was impressed at how invigorated he was with his North American experience.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Jim Lance had a big influence there because Jim Lance spent a lot of time in the United States before he came back to take up his position in
that was with
University.
Ray Adams, wasn't it?
Yes, that was Ray Adams. Of course, Ian McDonald did the same thing, actually, of going, well, didn't do the same thing, but certainly had a very meaningful experience in the United States. And let me just fill in the gaps, because I had been appointed to a position in Wellington Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it was just about 6 weeks before we were due to return to New Zealand, when I was at a cocktail party at Ian McDonald's place in London,
Mm-hmm.
and I was busily chatting with a visiting American professor.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Professor Arthur Asbury.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were chatting, he sort of said, well, I hope we meet up again. And a week or two later, I got a letter from him saying, dear Sumner Austin. So he had reversed my name, but nonetheless, he remembered, said, we're looking for somebody just like you in San Francisco. Here's a plane ticket, jump on a plane and come over and check us out and see whether you like the opportunity.
Right.
Now, that was so different to any experience I'd had in neurology up until that point, that somebody would be willing to say, come and check us out and here's the plane ticket, as opposed to presenting a dozen letters of recommendation from your teachers before anyone would consider you. And so I persuaded my wife to try this. I called up the people in Wellington and I said, would you be kind enough to give me a leave of absence to get some North American experience, which they were kind enough to do. And they kept my position open for a couple of years after that. But opportunities just seemed to open up so quickly in the States and continued to do so. And I found the work there so stimulating that in the end, I ended up staying in the United States. So I go back to New Zealand fairly often, and I'm always torn with what a wonderful country it is.
At that time, Austin, were there other extra challenges to move from British system to American system? Or were there more red tapes like USMLE and ECFMG and things like that?
Well, there's always a lot of red tape when it comes to the immigration system to the United States. It's true. I don't know. I obviously had people working for me because they insisted I take up my position, and my J visa had not come through at that point, and they said, "Come anyway because we are going to support you." And so I was there on a J visa initially, and that was written up such that I had to leave the country in 2 years and for 2 years before I could apply for permanent residency and all the rest of it. But when I went down to change my visa, there was a secret number there on it, and they immediately converted my visitor's visa to a J visa. I don't know whether anyone's lucky enough to have that happen now, but I was fortunate in respect to the visa. I did have to go through a nominal residency and not a residency. I didn't actually have to do a residency in the United States, but I did have to do an internship in surgery and in medicine. But it was a pretty nominal one. By and large, I hit the ground as an assistant professor in the States, and the rest flowed very easily. The state, the States is a great place for an academic neurologist or for any academician in medicine. There are just so many opportunities and to do meaningful research and to interact with academic colleagues that
I agree. Even now, when I attended pre-COVID time American Academy of Neurology meeting, you get inspired to see how promoting they are, the younger folks to sit with senior folks, all the sort of R2 grant programs and potential residents to come to chairs with some money to ask for a job that they like to do with win-win situation for both parties. Not many countries have such a system. I mean, I don't know every country in the world, but at least what I have read or what I have known, they probably stay way above other places. And you're probably right that the opportunities for someone who wanted to build an academic career is probably highest there, where whatever the background that you have, if you're prepared to work hard. Austin, given that we are concentrating on World Brain Day 2021 on multiple sclerosis, I would like to wake your memory lane up or walk through your memory lane with Ian McDonald. I never met him, but we all knew about him since our medical student days. What is your memory about him during the era of not having access to MR or rest of the other autoantibodies and other things? How clever he would have been to put his heart and soul into demyelinating disorders and MS in particular. So take us through the journey of the man and the caliber of him, and how was it to be around with him? I read somewhere that he was an avid bird watcher.
I don't think so. Not to my knowledge, Ian was not an avid bird watcher.
Right.
But Ian was a very inspiring man. Mm-hmm. He was a Renaissance man. He was very broadly read. Mm-hmm. He had a strong artistic ability. He played the piano and the harpsichord beautifully. So he was a great conversationalist, and for a young man to have the opportunity to interact with him closely mm-hmm. was a real pleasure. He had. I'm trying to remember the volumes that he used, but Ian, I think it really was Archie McIntyre, Professor McIntyre then, that selected Ian's doctoral subject. Mm-hmm. Raymond Adams and Waxman had just described a model of using diphtheria toxin mm-hmm. To demyelinate nerve. Mm-hmm. And Archie McIntyre suggested that this diphtheria toxin would be an ideal model to produce a model of a demyelinating disorder. Mm-hmm.
This is in Dunedin.
This is in Dunedin, yes, mm-hmm. when Ian was doing his PhD. Mm-hmm. And he did his PhD after he, of course, had completed his MB-CHP. Mm-hmm. I was doing my master's degree at the same time, and I assisted him as we would go down and inject these cats with a little diphtheria toxin. Mm-hmm. The cats that we were using as models were so tame that they would come up to you and purr as you gave them a little shot on their rear end of the toxin. But they would then go on to develop a hind limb ataxia. Mm-hmm. And then when you studied them electrophysiologically, you could see that there was conduction block and dispersion in the peripheral nerves restricted to the to the nerve roots, by and large, both proximal and distal to the dorsal root ganglia.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really a dramatic model of a clinical disability that looked like a cerebellar ataxia.
Mm-hmm.
Really was the consequence of severe proximal demyelination in the sensory nerve roots.
Mm-hmm.
And Ian studied the pathology of the demyelinating lesion, but I thought his pictures of the electrophysiology of demyelination were very dramatic,
Mm-hmm.
and really are among the most illustrative studies of the electrophysiology of demyelination in vivo.
Mm-hmm. And did you two go out to some of the Dunedin pubs or cafes from time to time when you were giving trouble to these cats to give them cerebellar ataxia and so on and so forth? Or was it all work, no play?
Electrophysiological experiments on cats take a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you start in the early hours of the morning. It's a rather prolonged surgery to do a careful laminectomy to expose all the roots.
Mm-hmm.
And your recordings go on way through the night.
Right.
And
right.
so that at the end of an experiment was generally about 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning.
So no pubs or cafes are open by that time.
So that the best one did going home was stop in at the bakery to get some freshly baked bread,
Right.
or to stop at the Chinese fish and chip shop, which seemed always to be open.
Right.
So there wasn't a lot of socializing at that time, but at other times, yes, there was a great deal of interaction. Ian and Julian Jack, I don't know whether you've heard of a Dr. J.B. Jack,
mm-hmm.
who was a Rhodes Scholar and went on to become an Oxford Don in physiology.
Mm-hmm.
And I was privileged enough to have conversations over glasses of wine with those guys on many occasions, and I learned a great deal from both of them.
I think for the youngsters, Austin, your story so far, I would like to summarize two aspects of how success come to someone. One is you nicely explain the friendships that you build among colleagues, although these days most youngsters are in fierce competition with each other. The real competition is collaboration. You do more things by working together. And you mentioned to us while young David Marsden, young Jim Lance, and young you.
Well, Jim Lance wasn't quite so young. He was a respected professor.
Right.
During my
so the Ian and those friendships probably would have helped each one of you to the push the boundaries in science further and further. And the second thing is be passionate on what you do and then work hard. Basically, I think those three things are basically the bound to give you success. Did I get that correct, or are there anything that you need to add?
Well, the only thing I'd qualify is the hard work. It never seemed like hard work. It was such a stimulating period, and one was finding out interesting new things, that it was just an exciting intellectual journey. And so I wouldn't have characterized it as hard work.
As hard work. So the curiosity and passion basically feed you to the work on them, and as you are enjoying what you are doing, so you didn't feel it as hard work. It's like with any work, doing the work is not the hard part. Thinking about it and complaining about it is probably the hard part.
And I should bring it into perspective, because in the field of multiple sclerosis, which our work was involved in some of the basic aspects of, the progress that we've made from, as you pointed out at the beginning, multiple sclerosis was very interesting from its clinical phenomenology when we were young, but we had no effective cures. And to see the progress that the basic science contributions have made collectively over the years to the state we're at now, although we don't have a cure, we have so many disease-modifying therapies that looking back, science works, research works. It's slow sometimes. We have a couple of steps forward, step backwards, but overall, it's a very satisfying life, and the satisfaction comes from making a real contribution to the health of people and improving people with neurological illnesses' quality of life.
That gives a nice, you are spot on, you hit the nail on the head. That gives a nice segue to my next question to you. Having seen the two massive organizations, the World Federation Neurology and Multiple Sclerosis International Federation, joining hands together to drive home the message to stop multiple sclerosis, given that we have like 2.8 million people with multiple sclerosis globally, 2/3 of the world still can't access early diagnosis or the good disease modifying therapies. So this sort of a global massive advocacy campaign is needed. As a person who spent almost the entire life on promoting brain health with significant passion in neurophysiology and helping Ian McDonald to do the initial understanding of underlying disease mechanisms of MS, how excited are you to see from the outside the main arena to see what the current day folks are doing to drive home the message and raising awareness on this disease affecting young people in particular at the prime of their life?
Well, it's extremely gratifying. Even when you don't have a cure for an illness, it's important that physicians provide care to their patients. And so providing care is at its heart the most important thing we do. But when we can both provide care and effective therapies, that is the most fulfilling aspect of being a physician.
I think you are a very wise man, Austin. They were golden words. The most important thing that we could do as human beings is to care, essentially. The care with effective treatment is even better. So I hope the youngsters out there would use the material that we created over the last couple of months passionately to drive home the message to raise awareness on multiple sclerosis globally. They would dip into our websites and download the toolbox and share them in their social media. I am having this ambitious agenda of seeing 2.8 million posts in individual Facebooks, Twitter accounts, LinkedIn, this and that, so that we can reach at least the 100 to 150 million people worldwide talking about brain health and the rest of the other things, as it is what makes who we are as human beings. Our brains matter most. Without our brains, we are absolutely nothing.
Yes, but like everything else in life, we only have a limited time to use our brains, and
important that we use it efficiently and effectively.
That we use it well.
Yes.
And
yes.
Although neurologists may have a longer intellectual lifespan than mathematicians, we all face the intellectual deterioration. Well, many of us face the intellectual deterioration that comes with age, but that still doesn't stop you being a witness to other people's contributions. I'm very fortunate, you mentioned early on, to have a daughter who is also a neurologist, not working specifically on multiple sclerosis, but I take a tremendous amount of vicarious pleasure, both being the father of somebody in neurology and learning from her contributions.
She is if you wouldn't mind, I wouldn't mind the talking about her a bit. She is a very well-known figure in neurology also. Am I correct to say that she is a world expert in spinal muscular atrophy related area at this point of time from Johns Hopkins?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment.
So
and her interests have actually expanded beyond spinal muscular atrophy, but that was certainly the major focus of her earlier intellectual life. But she is a neurogeneticist, and so she is also involved in a number of other genetic disorders. Spinal muscular atrophy, of course, was a particularly satisfying illness on which to work, because from an incurable disorder, we have, over the course of the last few years, moved to a position of having quite effective treatments for an otherwise crippling and fatal disorder.
Do you think that you had an impression on her for her to pick up neurology as a career option, or did that happen later on?
No, I think she did have very good opportunities. Even in high school, she came and worked in my lab, and then I introduced her to other people's labs, and she has had really golden opportunities to develop her scientific expertise. But what is gratifying is that she has put it to very good use.
I think that's the most important thing. My son is studying medicine in Melbourne at the moment, and he had been helping me with various the tablet-based vision and functional vision assessments in my research activities. But he, at this point of time, he's in second year, he always tells his mom, who is a psychiatrist, that I'm not particularly interested in neurologist. I don't want to be a guy like Dad. But it remains to be seen what he thinks.
It does. It might give you some comfort, because Charlotte, when she was younger, always said, I'm not going to be a doctor. All those pre-med people I meet are so nerdy.
Right. I'm hearing the same sort of conversation, but he's also growing up to be a fine young man. I wish you and Charlotte, her family, and your rest of the other family all the very best, and we greatly appreciate all the contributions that your generation and contemporaries have done. Before we finish off this interview, I think we probably addressed this issue throughout our very open, unprepared chat today. But what's your final take-home message to young folks out there, wherever they are, from rural, the Southeast Asian, East Asian countries to sub-Saharan African countries to most rural area in New Zealand or most rural area in Australia or Europe, Americas, Latin America, Northern, any part of the world? What's your take-home message to young folks who might bump onto this YouTube channel accidentally if they watch this far? What's your take-home message to them?
Try and seek out a mentor, because medicine is still an apprenticeship education, and if you're fortunate enough to be able to be exposed to people that have the patience and the time to educate you that's the best possible preparation for a career as a neurologist, realizing that you want to be a neurologist to cure neurological disease.
And also at the same time, I'll be opportunistic. What is your message to potential mentors? Why should they care about these young people? Why should they uphold and support this upcoming generation?
Well, why should they? Because it's enormously satisfying to pass on your corpus of experience to the next generation. It's a hard thing to do, actually. One tries to be a good teacher and mentor, but you find that each generation has to relearn certain of the same things. Knowledge doesn't linearly increase. It's always a matter of making some progress, and then there's some attenuation or loss of expertise from generation to generation. We find that we go and review the literature on things, and many of observations that we think are new have in fact been recorded and documented, but forgotten about, because when we review the literature, we go back 5 years and think that's the whole of the history of medicine, whereas our collective experience goes back a lot further.
You touched upon a very important area again. Without letting me finish this interview, I read I can't remember the exact particular bird. In birding world, some bird calls, because they don't have universities or schools, you have to learn the call from your seniors. Otherwise, you do not know how to make that particular call. Most birds make the call to attract females to sort of continue the generation. So you are absolutely spot on. Mentoring and keeping this connection going is really important for us to make progress. The older generation is not useless. There is a whole lot of wisdom that we can extract out of them, but at the same time, we must pass what we know to the next generation also. And you are absolutely spot on. There's nothing satisfying or gratifying than seeing what you have supported over the years and seeing them helping fellow human beings. After all, we all have a shelf life. We come here, we spend our time, and then when our time comes, we go. And it's important for us to have a good shot at life when we can, by giving the very best to fellow human beings, and then make sure that this continue, hopefully leaving a much better world than where we started when our time comes to leave. You agree?
I absolutely agree. I think, and it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you. You clearly are a wise man, and I'm extremely impressed with your own career. The only thing is you're doing so well in stroke care these days that the illness of cerebrovascular disease seems to be almost disappearing. That's an extreme statement, but it is so impressive the way that stroke care, which dominated my early career for inpatient care, the numbers are going down in a very gratifying way.
We still have some work to do, Austin. The last year I spent a lot of time in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic and this crazy war against the virus. It gives personally me an opportunity to study this more carefully. I sort of de-stress myself by working even longer hours. And we saw a very strong similarity between COVID-19 and brain involvement and what happened to the stroke brain after stroke. So while we have really improved acute stroke care so dramatically, almost letting people walk away from hospital almost independently, even after a massive middle cerebral artery stroke. I don't think the long-term post-stroke outcome we have made significant progress. I think at least at a personal level, our team had seen, and we published this with a series of manuscripts last year, which are available through PubMed. We told the world that how the post-COVID-19 brain and post-stroke brain in immune inflammatory way behaving more or less in the same way. I'm not saying that we find the solution, but at least we're asking the question, should we approach the whole post-stroke trajectory slightly differently? So time would tell us how we would unravel. So this is, as you very correctly said, the development is not it's never ending. You lose some knowledge and you gain some knowledge, and you have to continue to make progress. Yes, we are in this therapeutic era, but we still have a lot of things to do, to the extent that even if you convert all bright medical students in every medical school today to become neurology trainees, I think we still have enough work for them to do.
Good.
Thank you very much, the Professor Austin Sumner, and I troubled you a lot, almost close to an hour. I would love to ask more questions about late Professor Archie McIntyre and their wisdom, their wiseness, and I could picture in my head how you and Ian spending I had been to Dunedin multiple times. It's a beautiful city, but it's a very cold city also for the best part of the year. And I can picture how two young blokes were spending time so passionately studying the cat, the dissections, and then studying the myelin loss and this and that, making some great men, and the making the current progress that we made today, to the extent that we are now running a global campaign saying that we can stop multiple sclerosis. They all started in those little rooms in Dunedin at that time. And the great late Archie McIntyre probably impart the wisdom. It's the ironically, even today, if I take a world class to residents or medical students, I ask a question from them. All right, if you see a patient with acute Guillain-Barré syndrome in Melbourne, what is your differential diagnosis? Most of the time they stop, and I sort of keep supporting them. I was trained in sort of fear-based system also, the more or less, but I don't practice that anymore, or I never practiced that fear-based system. It's a collegial-based system now. I sort of try to get the two other answers. One is obviously acute diphtheria neuropathy, acute diphtheria toxin, because it causes demyelination. The other one is acute intermittent porphyria. Acute intermittent porphyria is common, but acute diphtheria is almost unheard of. So even years later, decades later, we haven't forgotten what you all have shown at that time. And we continue to pass them to even the second year, third year medical students today.
We're privileged to have had a career, well, in my own case, to have had a career in teaching. And of course, you, Tissa, are at the height of your powers in doing that.
Thank you so much, Austin. Stay well and safe, and pass our fondest regards to Charlotte also, and we would look forward to watch and see even more great things from the daughter as she continued to flourish from Johns Hopkins. I'll try and get hold of her for one of these interviews in time to come, if she's available.
All right. Well, I have no control over her availability.
Take care, Austin. Stay well and safe.
Right.
And all the best.
Really enjoyed our talk. Thank you.